Have you ever wondered what happens when a man who has spent his entire life playing tough guys in movies is confronted with his own weaknesses? When the weight of the years can no longer be ignored and he faces the question everyone dreads, what now? What comes next? The story I'm about to tell you today isn't about shootouts in westerns or a hero who never misses a punch. It's the real story of Clint Eastwood, a man who shaped the imagination of cinema for more than 9 decades, but who, in recent years, has encountered a new challenge, a challenge that not even the most ruthless gunslinger could face without hesitation. What if I told you that one of the greatest icons of American cinema found a road he never thought he'd travel? And what if that road wasn't a deserted highway full of dangers or a lawless city, but rather a spiritual path filled with questions and discoveries? Clint Eastwood has always been known for his silent presence, his gaze that says it all without needing words. But there's one thing few people know. Inside him, there has always been a restless man, someone who has spent his life searching for meaning, even if he didn't admit it publicly. A few months ago, he finished filming Juror No, perhaps his last job as a director. The film dealt with moral dilemmas, justice, and the consequences of our actions. But for Clint, something was still missing. He looked back and wondered, what about after this? What remains? It wasn't about his career. He knew his name was etched in the history of cinema. But what about his soul and his spiritual legacy? One evening at his ranch in California, he found a forgotten object in a drawer. It was an old Bible with a worn cover and some pages marked by years of use. It wasn't just any Bible. It was his mother's, who always told him when he was a child, "Clint, one day you'll understand that true power isn't in the strength of your fist, but in the strength of faith." He had never paid much attention to those words, at least not at the time. But now, sitting on his ranch's porch, watching the sun set on the horizon, he felt something different, something that wasn't just nostalgia or longing. It was a calling. And it was there, under that golden sky, that Clint made a decision. He wanted to understand. He wanted to know why so many people found peace and purpose in faith. He wanted to discover for himself if there was still something greater waiting for him at the end of the road. But this journey wouldn't be easy. After all, he'd always been a practical man, someone who trusted himself more than anything else. Faith, for him, had always been something distant, something that other people had, but that never seemed essential to his life. Still, he decided to take a step. In the following days, Clint began to remember the lessons his mother taught him when he was just a boy running around the yard. He remembered how she prayed before going to bed, how she always said that God doesn't give us all the answers right away, but he always gives us signs if we know where to look. He wondered, what if I've been ignoring these signs all these years? That's when he decided to seek answers. First, silently. He began to read the Bible, taking his time, reflecting on the words. Then he started watching testimonies of other people who had found God late in life. Some were former atheists, others people who had lost everything before rediscovering faith. And little by little he began to feel something different inside himself. It wasn't an instant conversion. It wasn't a moment of divine clarity where everything made sense all at once. But it was the beginning of something. And that beginning was enough to change everything. After all, Clint Eastwood never needed many dialogues to make his presence felt. But now his words were beginning to take on a new meaning. For the first time, he felt that maybe his story wasn't complete yet. Because, as he himself would later say to a close friend, "I've spent my whole life playing men who knew exactly who they were. But maybe, only now, am I really discovering who I am." And that, my friends, is the story we're about to tell. Have you ever tried to understand what goes on in the mind of the new generation? I know it seems like a simple question, But when you've got more than 90 years on the road, like Clint Eastwood, that answer can be more complicated than it seems. After finding that old Bible of his mother's, Clint knew he needed to go beyond. Silent reading at the ranch. He wanted to understand how faith fit into the modern world, in an age where people seem more connected to their phones than to anything else. That's when he decided to do something no one expected: participate in a conference on ethics in film and technology in Los Angeles. An event packed with young content creators, digital influencers, environmental activists, and advocates for social causes. Just picture the scene: Clint Eastwood, the man with no name himself, in the middle of an audience that probably knew him more from memes than from westerns. But what happened there was something he couldn't have predicted. At first, the conversations were cordial, but soon questions began to arise. A young activist, wearing a flat-brimmed cap and a t-shirt with the phrase, "Question everything," got straight to the point. "Mr. Eastwood, have you ever thought that your films might have glorified violence? What do you think about that today, after so much time?" Clint, with that calm gaze we know so well, gave a slight smile and replied, "I showed what the world was. But now I'm trying to understand what it has become." That response caught everyone by surprise. They were expecting the tough Clint, the guy who wouldn't budge an inch. But there he was, vulnerable, open to dialogue. Another young person, a digital influencer with millions of followers, joined the conversation. "But do you believe that faith still has a place in a world like ours, where science and technology explain almost everything?" And it was at that moment that Clint paused, looked at the Bible he had brought with him and said, "Technology can explain a lot, but it will never explain why, even surrounded by answers, we still feel empty. Faith fills those spaces that science can't reach." The silence that followed was almost palpable. It was as if those words had touched something inside, each of them, even if they weren't ready to admit it. But the turning point came when Clint shared something personal. He spoke about the loneliness he felt after years of success, about how fame didn't fill the void he didn't even know he carried. And above all, he talked about how faith was beginning to transform his life, even after so much time. "I've spent my entire life relying on myself, but I've discovered that in the end, we aren't as strong as we think, and that's okay, because it's in that moment that God steps in." These words didn't come from a preacher or someone who grew up in the church. They came from Clint Eastwood, a man who has lived long enough to understand that true strength isn't in never falling, but in knowing there's something or someone that picks you up when you fall. And that's how, at that conference in Los Angeles, Clint not only listened to the young people, but was also listened to. Not as a movie legend, but as a man searching for something greater. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. What happened after that will surprise you even more. Have you ever felt like you were in the right place, at the right time, but for a reason you couldn't understand? That's exactly what Clint Eastwood felt that day. A simple invitation to a conference in Los Angeles led him to an unexpected encounter with the new generation. But what no one imagined was that a few hours later, the city would be shaken by something much bigger than any debate about technology or ethics. While Clint was talking with the young people about faith and purpose, the earth began to shake. At first, it was a slight tremor, the kind that Californians are used to. But in seconds, the ground beneath their feet seemed to want to swallow the entire city. The building where they were was swaying from side to side, and what was a peaceful discussion turned into pure chaos. But here's what surprised everyone. While most ran to find shelter, Clint stood still, not out of fear, but because at that moment something inside him said there was a greater purpose in that situation. When the shaking finally stopped, the city was unrecognizable. Cracked streets, collapsed buildings, and sirens echoing in every direction. But amidst this apocalyptic scene, Clint felt a strange calm. He knew he needed to do something, and it wasn't just rescuing people from the rubble. It was something deeper. He and some of the young people he met at the conference began to help with the rescues. They found a group of children trapped under what was left of a school. As everyone tried to remove the debris with trembling hands, a little girl, no more than 7 years old, was stuck between concrete blocks. She was crying softly, calling for her mother. That's when Clint approached. He knelt beside the girl, took her hand, and instead of trying to pull her out by force, he began to pray. Yes, Clint Eastwood, the movie icon, the man who has always been the symbol of self-sufficiency and meaningful silence, was there, in the midst of chaos, whispering a prayer. Lord, be with us now. Give strength to this girl. Give peace to the afflicted hearts, and show us the way to bring her back home. His words seemed to hang in the air, silencing even the noise of the sirens for a brief moment. And then, something happened. The ground around the girl began to give way strangely, creating enough space for them to remove her without hurting her. It was one of those moments that makes you wonder, was it coincidence or was something greater at work? The young people who were there, many of whom had challenged Clint hours earlier about the relevance of faith, fell silent. One of them, the same one who questioned if faith had a place in a world driven by science, whispered that wasn't normal. But Clint didn't say anything. He just smiled with that calm look, as if to say, sometimes the answers we seek don't come in words, but in moments like this. After that, something changed. The group of young people who once viewed faith as something outdated began to see the world with different eyes. Not that everyone had become believers overnight, but that experience left a mark. They began to understand that faith isn't about controlling the world or having all the answers, but about finding hope even when everything seems lost. And you know what's even more interesting? Clint changed too. He realized that faith is not just an abstract belief, it's action. It's being present when things fall apart, literally. It's looking at the chaos around you and still having the courage to believe that something good can come from it. In the following days, as they helped rebuild the city, Clint and the young people shared more than just tools and supplies. They shared stories, doubts, and above all, hope. One of the most remarkable moments happened one night while the group was gathered around an improvised fire. One of the young men, visibly shaken, turned to Clint and said, "I've spent my entire life thinking that believing in something greater was a form of weakness. But after what I saw, after what we felt there, maybe I was wrong." Clint simply replied, "True strength isn't in denying your doubts, but in finding the courage to face them." And that's how that earthquake not only shook the city of Los Angeles, but also the hearts of everyone who was there. Because sometimes the earth needs to shake so we can wake up to what really matters. And if you're listening to this now, perhaps it's the moment to ask yourself, what keeps you steady when everything around you seems to crumble? Because ultimately, we all face our own earthquakes in life. And it's in those moments that we discover that sometimes faith is the only foundation that remains. Have you ever stopped to think about the power a story has? I'm not just talking about movies or books. I'm talking about those stories that change the way you see the world, and even how you see yourself. After what happened in Los Angeles, but the earthquake, the rescue of the little girl, the prayer that seemed to have changed everything, Clint Eastwood couldn't simply go back home and pretend nothing had happened. Something inside him had changed, and he knew that transformation needed to be shared, but he also knew he couldn't do it alone. That's when the idea came. Why not unite the wisdom of a lifetime in cinema with the energy and fresh perspective of those young people he met? After all, they had also been touched by that experience. Even the most skeptical were beginning to see the world in a different way. Clint gathered the group and made a proposal that no one expected. Create a project. Together, something that went beyond a simple film. They would tell stories of faith, hope, and transformation, but with a modern approach that spoke to the current generation. The project was called Renewed Hearts. Just imagine Clint Eastwood, the master of westerns and suspense, side by side, with young digital influencers, environmental activists, and independent filmmakers. It was an unlikely mix, but that's exactly what made the project work. Each one brought something unique to the table. Clint, with his experience telling stories that resonate with audiences for decades, knew how to capture the emotion and essence of the human journey. The young people, on the other hand, brought a new perspective, connecting these stories with current themes such as mental health, social justice, and the impact of technology on our lives. And most importantly, everyone was united by something greater. They wanted to show the world that faith is not something old-fashioned or outdated. It's alive, it adapts, it finds ways to touch people, even in a world that seems increasingly disconnected from the spiritual. Filming began in different parts of the country. They interviewed people who had gone through experiences of spiritual transformation, from former skeptics who found faith after personal losses, to young people who discovered a greater purpose amid the crises we face today, such as the pandemic or the fight against inequality. One of the most remarkable stories was that of a young man who, after years of dealing with depression and anxiety, found in the Christian faith not only comfort, but also a new reason to live. He said something that stuck in everyone's mind. "I thought that believing in something greater was a sign of weakness, but I discovered that true strength is in admitting that we need help." Those words echoed in Clint's heart. He knew exactly what that young man meant. After all, he had also spent his entire life relying only on himself, until he realized that there is a greater force that sustains us when we can no longer go on alone. And you know what was even more incredible? The impact the project had. When Renewed Hearts was released, it wasn't long before it went viral on social media. But it wasn't just because of the well-produced videos or the emotional stories. It was because those stories spoke directly to people. They showed that faith is accessible to everyone, regardless of age, past, or circumstances. Messages began to arrive from all parts of the world, people sharing how the stories inspired them to seek something greater, to reevaluate their lives, or simply to find comfort in knowing they are not alone in their struggles. And in the midst of all this, Clint realized something that was perhaps the most important lesson of all. Faith isn't just about believing in God. It's about believing that even in the darkest moments there is light. That even when everything seems lost, there is hope. And that's the message I want to leave with you today. If you've ever felt lost, if you've ever questioned your purpose, or if you felt that you no longer have the strength to continue, remember, you are not alone. There is a story being written in your life as well. And just as Clint and those young people discovered, sometimes the greatest transformation happens when you least expect it. So tell me, what's your story? Have you ever heard the phrase, "The end is just the beginning"? Well, it's true. If there's one thing Clint Eastwood learned on this journey, it was exactly that. After everything he'd experienced, from movie screens to the earthquake-shaken streets of Los Angeles, from challenging conversations with young people to creating the Renewed Hearts project, Clint realized that his story wasn't complete yet. In fact, maybe it never would be, because in the end, the true journey isn't about what you achieve out there, but about what you discover in here. And it was that discovery that led Clint back to his roots. One morning, he decided to visit a small church where he was baptized as a child, a simple place made of old wood, hidden in a small town that time had almost forgotten. But for him, that place carried more meaning than any Hollywood studio or movie award. Upon entering the church, Clint felt a peace that he hadn't felt for years. It was as if that space had been waiting for him all this time. He walked to the altar, holding his mother's Bible in his firm hands, but with an open heart. And there, before God and all those who had been part of his journey, Clint shared his truth. I've spent my whole life playing strong men who didn't need anyone. But today I'm here to say that true strength isn't in walking alone. True strength is in recognizing that we need something greater than ourselves. Those words weren't just for the audience. They were for himself. Because for the first time in a long time, Clint felt free. Free from the burden of expectations, from the need to prove anything to the world. He had found something that no role in a movie could give him, the peace that only comes when you surrender control and trust in God. And you know what was most beautiful? Seeing how his journey inspired others. The young people who were once skeptics were now there, sitting on the church benches, listening attentively. Some with tears in their eyes, others simply in silence, absorbing every word. But Clint wasn't there to preach. He was there to share, to show that regardless of where you came from or what you've done, there is always a way back. God is always waiting with open arms. No matter how far you've gone, Clint said, God doesn't look at your past. He looks at your heart. Those words stuck in the minds of everyone who was present. Because deep down, we all carry doubts, fears, and regrets. But the truth is that there's always a chance to start again. And that's how Clint ended his journey. Not with a big speech or a dramatic ending, but with a simple smile and a silent prayer. Because he knew that the true impact isn't in the words, but in the actions. Now I want to ask you, what is your journey? What's stopping you from seeking something greater? Clint's story shows us that it's never too late to change. It's never too late to find a new purpose, a new hope, a new faith. And if this story has touched your heart in any way, I invite you to be part of that journey too. Subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this. Give it a like, share with someone who you think needs to hear this message, and comment down below, what was the moment when you felt that God was speaking to you? Remember, your story can also be the beginning of someone else's transformation. Until next time, and may God bless you and your journey.